Introduce Michelle Bailey. Michelle is the GVP and GM, as well as IDC Research Fellow at IDC. She's going to be talking to us about COVID's impact on women in technology and sharing IDC's research findings. Welcome, Michelle.
Good morning. First of all, are you able to hear me?
Yes, we hear you just fine.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So I am thrilled to be back again here today. It doesn't seem like it was a year ago that we presented at the fabulous 25th anniversary celebration conference with Witty when we're all back in California. And of course, this has been probably the most remarkable year of my life. I'm not sure about you. But in many respects, that time has gone by extremely quickly, and we have remained very committed, along with Witty, to be able to communicate with all of you, get your feedback, and really take a pulse on where you are with your career, what you're thinking about, where you're going to be going forward. And I love the session this morning. I think we're going to be seeing more of that around a focus around health and well-being going forward. But we have recently completed a new set of research that we did with the Witty membership, as we've done every year, in addition to some other partners that we work with in this space, really to dig into what's happening around diversity and inclusion in the tech sector. And I can tell you that the data in many respects is very consistent with what we saw last year, and yet there's a lot of difference we saw around things such as organizational trust. Clearly, the impact of COVID has impacted everybody's jobs. And so there are a lot of really interesting new findings that I'm going to walk you through. And then when I'm done with the research this year, I'm going to introduce you to a couple of really great panelists. I'm very excited to have Renee Redwood speaking with us, as well as Kira McAngan from Ring Central. And they're going to be talking through what they see around leadership, and particularly around diversity and inclusion in the tech sector. So we've got a great session this morning. Let me just jump you through what we talked about last year when we did this research. And, you know, when I ended the presentation last year, the results of the data was very much around this idea of future of work, right? Remember when we used to talk about how everybody was looking forward to this new generational, multi-generational co-working arrangement, and having this modern shared office, and being able to be more productive in co-working spaces and at remote sites. Remember those good old days? Well, needless to say, a lot of those things have changed over the last several months. We also did spend a lot of time, though, last year talking about pay gap and pay equity issues. We spent a lot of time going through what unconscious bias is and how we saw it in our data, particularly in the responses that men and women give as part of this research. We talked about the role of mentoring and how mentoring can really help in your career. We know that women who are mentored by men make about 13% more in their salary than women who are mentored by other women. Right, that was a really interesting finding. We went through a lot around discrimination and sexual harassment and the issues that we had seen around that. Needless to say, that has changed pretty dramatically this year. What I really was excited about last year was new labor laws. So there are several new laws implemented last year. One of them was the California Bill 826 that was put forward by Senator Jackson, which really pushed for more women participating on boards of public companies in California. So today, every board in California has to have at least one woman on the board, and I believe it's this year that it will go to 2. That has really had a dramatic impact on what the board makeup looks like. In the last year, for most public companies, we've actually seen an expansion in the number of individuals on a company board, to include people of color, to include women. And so we've seen the typical size of a board go from, say, maybe 6 or 7 to more like 10 to 11 constituents there. So we saw pretty dramatic changes through some of those new labor laws. So we were feeling pretty good when we got through 2019. And then, of course, COVID hit. It has been certainly something that has been universally One of those things where it's just been a dramatic hit to the way we behave in our work, the way we do our work, how we talk and communicate to others in our organizations with respect to work. And of course, the major impact for everybody has been a shift to work from home. So 72% of the women that we talked to as part of the study say the shift to home was really the top impact for their job and their working conditions as a result of COVID. You know, when you look down this chart on the right-hand side, you can also see what the other impacts have been to women and men, that it's a distraction, right? You're trying to do your work while you're trying to communicate with your family and keep up with your family responsibilities. And of course, everyone's concerned about their job security. You know, there's nothing like a productivity killer when you've got people that are stressed and anxious around job security. I think the other thing that was interesting for me in this data is how we're all working longer hours and overtime, right? And we all talk about this. There just never seems to be an end to a day, where the beginning is and where the end is. But we're also talking about facing heavier workloads. I know I feel that myself, and many of my colleagues talk about that also. And then the other thing that I think I've seen pretty universally is new business processes and operations being implemented. So some of that's in response to COVID. If your business was, say, a business that was focused on being in person or having more manual processes, a lot of that has been switched over to digital and new digital processes. All right, we've seen that in a lot of different industries, whether it's retail and even the food industry. Obviously, healthcare and education were heavily impacted there. So that's very stressful, right? So you're not just dealing with the changes in your private life and your work conditions, but you're also dealing with changes in the business, and change is hard at the best of times. So there's a lot of things that I thought were really interesting in that data. Men talk about being less productive now that they're working from home. So all of these things I think are quite stressful. We're certainly not seeing a lot of people talk about working less hours and having a lighter workload. You know, all these people, I find them incredibly annoying when they say, I just don't know what to do with my day anymore. So I think that's been a real reset for me in understanding that a lot of people are feeling the way I am. And when we talk about the return to normal, I think the big takeaway from what I've been able to glean from the work that I do as part of my research and also as part of talking to my colleagues is that probably we'll never go back to this idea of normal. And when we asked you all how long you thought it would be before we got back to some kind of normal state, the average was about 10 months. Men think it's going to take about 8 months. Women think it's going to take more like a year. Again, men tend to be quite optimistic about these things. Only about 10% of you said never get back to normal, but look at this data, which would tell us that it's probably unlikely that we go back to the way we were. So this is a view of how you think about your job interactions. And at the bottom of it, we've sort of got this idea of zero contact, right? How many of you would describe your job before COVID as having zero contact, meaning that you're exclusively working from home and you're mainly on video or phone? And then you kind of move up the stack to low contact or close contact, where you're just dealing with a number of limited individuals. And then this idea of trusted contact, that you do have contact with a large group, but they tend to be someone in your trust sphere. And then you've got this idea and concept of open or wide contact and having much broader contact with coworkers or the public. Now look at the difference between men and women. So prior to COVID, 43% of women said that their job really entailed them having open or wide contact with coworkers or the public. And now take a look to the middle bars and see where we are today. So about 75% of women, again, say that they've pretty much gone to a zero contact phase when it comes to their job. Men are out a little bit more, have a little bit more of that low contact, but everyone's pretty much either work from home or have very, very limited in-person contact. So when we start to think about 8 months or 12 months from now, where do people think that they want to ideally, what type of interactions do they want to have ideally? And you can see that nobody really goes back to the way we are, if we can help it. Particularly women who are thinking about more low contact roles or even close contact roles versus having that wide open contact. So that's a big change that's coming. And I think that we're all learning through that right now. We're certainly learning about how our organization can respond and change as part of that new behavior. But it's very clear that, at least for the foreseeable future, we probably won't ever really go back to the way things were with sort of wide open travel. This idea that we're easily able to get to the office and go meet with as many individuals as we want to meet with. So here's why that's really important. I might have presented this to you before, but I'm going to go through it quickly. 86% US GDP is driven by services industries or the construction industry. And a services industry is all those things that have been heavily impacted by COVID. So healthcare, retail, education, financial services, government, hospitality, and then of course the gig economy. So this tells you why the impact on the economy has been so severe and why there's been so much money pumped into the economy to prop it up, because pretty much everything we do today across all those industries that we think about are services led. And the thing that's unique about services businesses is they're people intensive businesses, right? Services businesses are very hard to automate. This is really the promise of AI, that you can take a services industry and use robotics or use artificial intelligence to provide an assist to workers, but pretty much everything in services requires people. Manufacturing, however, is already very highly automated, right? So manufacturing has gone through a long period of change and has almost entirely flipped over to automation. And that's very true of agriculture also today. And you can see that very, very few of US employees are actually part of the manufacturing or agricultural sector. The number one employer in the United States today is healthcare in almost every state of the United States. So I think this gives you a really good example of why people and getting people together is so critical to drive business forward. It also tells you why it's been so important that we've been able to change and adjust the way we work. And the tech sector has done better than most other industries, and it's because we've been able to work remotely. And for many of us, having that technology available is something we've had good access to. What I've been shocked about is how much inequity there is in what I consider pretty basic services now, whether it's even internet connectivity to the home. I thought that we would do pretty well with education being online. From my perspective, that was a complete fail. And clearly in healthcare, we're not at the point where everybody can go to telemedicine, right? There's still a lot of in-person work to be done there. So this is why there's been so much investment from the government in propping up not just the economy, but providing money to those workers who are at home and are unable to do their jobs while they're at home. And then, of course, something that I've spent a lot of time on over the last couple of months has been this complete uprising around racial injustice. I will say that I've been really happy to see the response from the tech vendors around, particularly the response to Black Tuesday. I've seen Cisco, for example, on Black Hat Tuesday, they actually closed down their major conference that had been online. They postponed it they pushed it out a couple of weeks, and their officers actually weren't working. And we saw, similarly, we saw pretty incredible responses from the CEOs of Microsoft and Dell, from Google, Apple, HPE. Really, I thought heartfelt responses and support for solidarity, support for their employees who are impacted by all of these just incredibly awful issues of racial injustice that we've seen. And I think for all of us, it's uncovered what we've known about our own research, where there are systemic issues in every aspect of society, but clearly, particularly in this country, around racism. And that the impact isn't just for these tech companies' employees, but it's also very much about their local communities and about their customers as well. So it was very universal, I thought, the response that we saw. And essentially, the outcome is that a lot of these tech vendors realize that it's not just enough to be supported, but they have to be an ally in this process, whether it's to do with hiring with their own employees or the work they do in their communities, or bringing attention to other businesses that need that level of support. I thought that the response that we saw is something quite different than I've certainly seen in my past history and the work that I've done. So I think several things that it's highlighted, again, the inequity that exists everywhere. It's not just the tech sector, the education sector, the healthcare sector, clearly the criminal justice industries and sectors, and that we need to rethink the way we think about closing gaps in technology. And oftentimes we talk about the last mile, right? So being able to get access to those users at the last mile, whether they're in countries at risk or their communities at risk. I think we've got to start thinking about it as the first mile, right? That the user is where the focus needs to be, and that if you can't get access to everybody, then we are going to continue to have this idea of digital injustice. And it is things like internet access, and it's not just access, it's quality of access. So, you know, it may be one thing to be able to have internet access, but if the speed of the broadband that you have coming into your building is slow, you're not able to get your work done. You're not able to go to class. It's got a completely different connotation to it than what we've seen recently. I've been thinking about mobile video and the role that it has played around being able to provide awareness of just how much racial injustice there is in the United States. That is something that I think everybody needs access to, and is certainly something that we've seen has been critical in being able to drive, again, greater awareness and understanding of really what does happen in communities where we certainly, or I certainly don't have access to that. And then artificial intelligence, it's both been, I think, something that's been very positive, and yet we've also seen issues around AI. So for example, IBM just last week backed off on its AI solutions that had been providing to police forces because they felt that it was not doing a good job with facial recognition, and so they actually pulled that technology. So it's very, very clearly something that we see is still coming and it needs work. But the big takeaway for me from all of this that we've seen over the last few months is that tech is both a solution to challenges that we have. It has the ability to be a force multiplier. And when you're a force multiplier, it comes with both good and bad outcomes. And the level of responsibility that I think tech vendors, the leaders in tech, are starting to recognize is that it's not just about hiring. It's not just about having more diverse workforces. It's actually thinking more broadly, and the really the ability that tech has to be an influence of both good and bad on broader communities, I think, has really been highlighted recently. So this is why I talk a lot about these numbers. I'm not going to go through all of this. Suffice to say, when we look at hiring in the tech sector, we still face so many challenges around greater diversity. It isn't just women, it's African Americans, it's the Hispanic population particularly. This idea that we can have a diverse tech workforce that really represents what the population looks like is still quite a ways away. I have been encouraged to see over the last year, a number of tech vendors have put in place hard metrics and goals for themselves around where they plan to be. Those goals extend out to 10 years often, and that's because this isn't an overnight fix. There is no one silver bullet to fixing this. It's a pretty interesting and long task around hiring and retention and changing cultures, and really thinking differently about what a diverse population in the tech sector looks like. But again, this is not something that we're going to be able to change overnight. And again, I think it really speaks to the responsibility that technology companies have, not just as part of the products that they bring to market, but also their ability to be a force multiplier as an employer. So let me take you through some of the data from this year. I have shown you this before. I bring this to your attention just because we know there are systemic problems in the tech sector. We've seen this in our data. We know that men are much more positive in their views around diversity than what women are, but the gender diversity and racial diversity still tend to sit at the bottom in terms of thinking about employee diversity in the tech sector. A lot of you told us that you thought that diverse employee hiring and retention still had a long way to go. Only 38% of you had strong agreement that your organization had a diverse employee or diverse employee capabilities in hiring and retention. But half of you did feel that you did have an inclusive culture at your organization where everybody feels respected or appreciated. And of course, what that tells us is half of you don't right, think that that's the case. So there's still work to be done there. One of the things that I think has become very clear, not just in the tech sector, but in our society in general, is the role of federal and state and local laws and the role that they play. When we asked about equal pay, we know that a lot of you feel that, or particularly the women that we spoke to, feel like that the local laws are not adequate. Men feel differently, right? And of course, I talked about this last year as part of unconscious bias. It just depends on your point of view in terms of how you view this. Clearly, African Americans feel differently. about federal, state, and local laws around race and being paid equally for similar work. And it's really about enforcement. So for me, this is one of those things that's incredibly difficult. We do have laws around discrimination. You've seen recently that we now have new laws around discrimination becoming part of the Civil Rights Act. It's really about how do you enforce it. And the challenge here is that it's not easy to enforce. It's not consistently enforced. And that we really have to think about how do employers in the tech sector become employers of trust. And I'm going to talk about that as we get through some more of the data here. So I think one of the challenges that we've had, particularly around women, and thinking about what we all want to get out of a career in the tech sector, is there's been this myth that women just really care about their jobs because of the job benefits and flexibility. And we did show this last year. But number one for both men and women in terms of what they want to get out of their job is compensation. They want to be paid fairly. And it's actually more important for women than it is for men. Now, what's different this year is this notion of sense or purpose. So sense of purpose is still the number two gauge of a successful job or career overall. But what's different this year is men don't feel quite the same. Last year, men were right there with women. They thought that that was their number two metric for success. What men are a lot more interested in this year is stability and security, and to build skills, even more so than what we saw last year. Men still care a lot more about benefits than women do, but there has been this shift with men to this idea of stability and security. However, everybody still feels that work-life balance is important. I think nothing has shown that more than what's happened over the last several months with work from home. Having work-life balance when it's all happening at home has been difficult. But there, I think, is a better connection to the family and an understanding that you have to take care of your family and yourselves first in order to really be able to achieve and be productive as an employee. And I've seen really good, huge support in the tech sector for that. And we've seen some pretty bold statements around work from home. And a lot of the tech companies have actually come out and said that employees can continue to work from home if they want, or even think about working from other regions in the country. So I do think this is going to be a very, very different focus for us going forward. And what, of course, we all know is that diversity isn't just about doing the right thing or doing something that's fair. I really actually take exception to that. Having a diverse workforce is just good business sense. And we've seen this time and again in our data, but most of you recognize that the impacts of a lack of a diverse workforce really are in missed business opportunities, right? That you don't have bold new ideas come to the table or different ideas coming to the table. And that a lot of you, particularly women, are concerned that hiring for the future is going to be impacted and that you won't be able to attract the right types of employees or prospects if you don't have a diverse workforce that's appealing, particularly for that new generation of worker. So we've known this for a while, that diversity isn't really, it's really a business problem. And what we also know is that discrimination goes down as diversity goes up in an organization. So we've seen this with women around gender. We asked the same questions this year around racial diversity. We do see similar trends. I will say that gender discrimination is much more impacted by an increase in diversity than what we've seen around racial diversity. I think some of that is because of the different components that we think about around racial and ethnic diversity. I do think it's also because, frankly, we haven't been able to get a lot of African Americans or Black employees to complete our survey. So we're going to be working really hard on that in the second phase of this survey to get much broader participation of those that bring, I think, very different ideas than we've been able to bring into this research before. And I think it's critically important. But clearly we know that as a workforce becomes more diverse, that it frankly lowers all these issues that we do see around discrimination, and it makes for a much more, not just harmonious business environment, but it also means that there are better business outcomes from that. So this is something that I thought was interesting to compare for over time. You know, we've been asking for several years now, what is your current rate of women as employees? What is your current rate of women as new hires and women as part of senior leadership? And what we have seen is that those numbers have been going up over time. I can tell you that the numbers here are a little bit higher than what we see in the industry in general, particularly that number of women in senior leadership. But you can see that from those of you that are completing the survey that you do believe that those numbers are going up slightly over time. What was really interesting was to look at the men here and compare them to what men think is the optimal number of women as employees and what women think of as an optimal number of employees. So last year, men told us they thought the optimal number of women as employees was about 35%, 30 to 35%. This year, there was a big jump, up to 45%. So men's opinions in terms of what looks like optimal is quite different than what we saw last year. Then when we look at women last year already thought that roughly 50% was the right number, and it's gone up a little tiny bit this year. But men's optimal number for 2020 is still behind where women thought it should have been for 2019. So again, it gives you this viewpoint into how we all think differently about different issues, particularly if they don't impact us. Again, I think what's happened over the last couple of months has really helped change attitudes here. And certainly we're starting to see a shift in what we think of as sort of an ideal workplace situation. We also know that as you drive greater diversity at the senior leadership level, that it has a very, very strong impact downstream on all employees. And you can see this here. So we know as the percent of women in senior leadership increases, which is what we're showing on the x-axis, that it has very, very positive impacts and actually predicts major job factors for female employees. So as the number of women in senior leadership rises in a company, we also know that the female employees are more likely to think that their company values diversity and inclusion, that the company is seen as trustworthy, that it makes a difference in job performance, that it improves job satisfaction. Women are more likely to stay 3 or more years, and that women are more likely to believe that they're paid equally compared to men for similar roles. So when we talk about the changes at the senior leadership, it's not just about having policies in place that senior leadership can only really drive. It's really about changing behavior and changing thinking for those female employees that are at that company. And it really gives you the ability, I think, as a woman to see yourself in the senior leadership team. And also, of course, to see yourself thinking about senior leadership capabilities for yourself. So interestingly, this year, we sort of saw similar things to what we saw last year. So we asked women, do you aspire to executive or management roles? Women are more likely to think about themselves in a board seat or think about themselves on the ELT or executive leadership team. Again, this year, less women want to be CEO. We don't know necessarily if that's because you don't want to be a CEO of the way a CEO is today, or you're just not that interested in being the lone person who would rather work as a team. What did change this year was women looking to start their own businesses. And last year, only 15% of women said that they were interested in starting their own business. Almost 40% said that they're thinking about starting their own business this year. So what does that tell you? It tells us that women are thinking about taking more control over their job and job prospects, and that starting their own business is something that's more appealing than it has been before. And I do think that's directly related to what's happened over the last several months. And there definitely is some credence to that. We've definitely seen this new wave of VCs start to look and expect that companies they're going to fund and invest in have a diverse workforce at the get-go. And it really is a way to ensure a more diverse culture in an organization if it, of course, starts out as diverse in the first place. In terms of those skills to get to senior management, men focus on skills almost exclusively: management skills, communication skills, decision-making skills, presentation skills, multilingual skills. Men are all about skills. Women, on the other hand, we tend to think that we need more political acumen and have a vision, get support from management, and build allegiances and alliances. It's a very, very different approach. So training for women in this space is obviously clearly different from men. I would actually say that women should be focusing on the skills as well that men clearly focus on, particularly now, and I'll show you a little bit more data on this as we wrap this up. We heard a lot from you around what the blockers are to you moving into executive management. Some of it is that, those seats are held for 30 years. It's hard to feel like you're visible, especially now and when you're working from home, that you feel like you have to build trust, that you don't necessarily want to work those unlimited hours. And of course, just this idea that your workplace has an older style of thinking and that management, I thought this one was really interesting. My management style is more servant leadership and is not respected in most institutions where they prefer more command and control. So I really do think it speaks to this idea that women may have a very different leadership style where you're there to serve your employees and help them get their job done. And then, you know, this is something that we're seeing more and more. There is concern amongst men. I'm a white male in an industry dominated by white males, so I'm often overlooked in place of a more diverse candidate. You know, this is something definitely to be careful of. I think there needs to be work done to lower the fear here. Again, I think that this is something that really isn't a crisis. I think it's something that just really speaks to what is common fear amongst people that they're going to miss out on an opportunity. And I think that, again, the more diverse a workforce becomes, I think the less we're going to see issues around this. So what does trust look like going forward? We can actually predict organizational trust from the data that we collected from all of you. And we know that organizational trust from your perspective, it's really driven by three things. It's the CEO, it's your company's customers, and it's your senior leadership team. So I think for a lot of us, we feel like our happiness in our job is actually driven by our manager. And we know that colleagues in your immediate team play a very, very strong role. And even those just outside your immediate team, right? That's the day-to-day interaction. But when you're thinking about the trust in your company, it actually does come from the very, very top. And men are much more likely, as you think about the trusted practices on the right-hand side, you know, women, when they think about the trusted practices that they use to judge trust in their organization, they think about the ethics of their business and that just delivering on what we say we're going to do, right? Being consistent, being accountable, providing good communication and respect. Men, on the other hand, are much more likely to think about those technical aspects of working in a tech company. So security around data, having technical expertise is of course important as well. So I think that's really pretty interesting. But clearly senior management is the table stakes here. We've seen it in a lot of our data before, but I think this is the first time where we've been able to actually tie it back to this idea of trust in an organization, which is critical. You know, I showed you some of this data last year around the types of companies that, or the companies that you would be interested in working for. So we asked you, who would you select as a future employer amongst a list of the top tech leaders? And then who would you avoid on the y-axis? And you can see that for women, they're a lot more interested in those cloud companies, right? Microsoft, Salesforce, Google, even Apple. And it's really because of the growth potential and future success that comes with working with those high growth companies. We did see Salesforce and SAP and ServiceNow move up into the right-hand quadrant this year. And really have made some moves in terms of their building their brand around trust and the ability to grow. The social media companies had a hard year this year. Facebook particularly took a decline. We saw Twitter down a little bit. You know, you've seen some of that over the last few weeks, the wars that have happened over social media and the response around privacy concerns and response to what we could think of as maybe fake news in quotes. So I think that's clearly had an impact on the way that particularly women think about employability options at some of those companies. I think what's really interesting is when we switch to men. So men have basically the same top selection criteria that women have. They're looking for growth too, and to work at a company that builds great quality products and services. But there's two takeaways here. Men will work at many more companies than women will. You can see everything's kind of moved over to the right. Men are much more likely to select all these companies as a future employer. But when you look in that upper right-hand quadrant, it's actually those more traditional tech companies that men have more interest in. So Dell, Intel, Cisco, Oracle, right? These companies that had a infrastructure heritage, even the telcos are seen as more appealing compared to women. So I thought that was very, very interesting. That women are looking more, I think, to some of these cloud companies as a way to do a reset, right? Hoping that a newer company will have a different culture and think differently about diversity and inclusion. And maybe it's easier to work there than it is to go back and work at a company where it's got a much deeper heritage around infrastructure, even though a lot of those companies have some pretty bold, I think, new metrics and goals that they've put in place around diversity. I've actually seen a lot of change there in the last 12 months or so. And then finally, I'm just going to leave you with a couple of these. Last year, we were able to determine that there's about 9 different personality types in the tech sector in terms of thinking about different types of employees. And we know that these different types of employees have very, very different priorities when they think about companies. So, and the number one group last year was this group called those that are interested in personal development, building your skills, moving forward in your career, moving up the career ladder. You can see that there are others such as faith, those that are driven by their faith, those that really want to focus more on close personal relationships and relationships at home. So this was a really, really unique set of analysis that we did last year, and it helped us to uncover how tech companies can think about attracting new employees and the things that they should focus on. Well, take a look at this year. What's number one this year? Health and well-being, the group of health and well-being. Everybody just wants to be well and focus on well-being, focus on faith. There's a lot of praying going on right now, close personal relationships, wealth. I think I would call this a renewed focus on wealth. And I think it's related to financial independence and sort of the job insecurity that I think a lot of us are feeling. And then a focus on family and happiness again. So it's pretty different. I have to say, it made me a little sad to see that personal development persona disappear into these other things. It's understandable, of course, that we're all in this phase of focusing on our health and well-being and our families, and thinking differently about our financial future. But we're not going to be in this forever, right? Maybe it's 8 months, maybe it's a year. But I actually think this is a pretty important time where we can think about 2020 being a reset and not really a lost year. Clearly, the focus on wellness is important. You should focus on wellness because we saw in the data, everybody else is focusing on wellness. And it's not just your mental and physical fitness. I think it is about taking care of your loved ones. I know even for myself, it's about practicing patience, right? I can only control what I can control. And thinking about being patient around things that I just don't have the ability to move forward. I think that's been difficult for everybody and something of a frustration. I would say you should be focusing on developing your skills. And we saw in the study, AI was the number one skill everybody wanted to develop. Data mining and analytics, anything around data and governance, cloud and cybersecurity. Even if you're not technical, you should learn these technologies. If you're in marketing or sales, for example, you should really dig in and understand what these tools and technologies are and what they can mean for the future of yourself and your own career and your company going forward. And these can be courses that you can take, certifications that you can take. A lot of this stuff is free online right now. And then I think you should be taking time to build your brand. Spend more time looking at what you're doing on social media. Really think about what you want to look like as an employee at the end of 2020. And it doesn't just mean building your brand in work, right? This could be something around the impact that you can have, your social impact. Maybe you can offer digital skills to some small mission-based startups. Help support others and give them air cover or give them drive better awareness for them where they don't have the same opportunities. And I would spend more time with networks and associations. You're doing it today, which I think is fantastic. In a world where we can't network easily in the way we used to, you should really join some of networks and associations and make some contacts within there and get online and start meeting with people or maybe doing some joint social impact work that you haven't been able to do before. And you probably do have a little bit more time once you get past everything that's going on at home. We're not traveling, we're not commuting. So try to use that time, I think, wisely. And we would love to hear more from you. If you go to witty.com/survey, please take the survey. Again, we're going to be reaching out to other communities so that we can build out some more of this data, and we'll share that final data with you. I'd be happy to share a lot of these slides also as we go through this. So for now, I am going to move forward and move into our panel. I'm hoping, Dave, that you can bring Kira and Renee online because I'm not able to see them right now. I am going to stop sharing the screen and see if that helps. So Kira McKangan, who is the Chief Innovation Officer at Ring Central, she is a force. Kira leads a team of 1,000 developers, product designers, and architects, men and women globally across both North America, Europe, and APAC. Kira is also the chairwoman, and she's the lead for Ring Central's diversity and inclusion efforts. Kira, are you online?
I am. I have to mute myself. Thanks. Thank you.
Sure. And I'm also thrilled to introduce Renee Redwood. Renee, are you there?
I am here.
Hi, Renee. Renee is the CEO of Redwood Enterprises. Renee runs her own company and really drives leadership around debate, around policies, certainly around practices of equity and inclusion. And Renee is famous for being the president or the director of the Presidential Glass Ceiling Commission that wrote that fantastic glass ceiling report. So Renee, thrilled to have you online.
Delighted to be here. Thank you.
Hi, great to see you. So maybe I would just like to start with both of you. You saw the research. Renee, I'm sure this is for you, feels a little bit like Groundhog Day.
Yeah.
So I would just love to talk to both of you, particularly you, Kira. Maybe, Kira, I'd love to know, what do you think has led to your career success? Like, can you talk a little bit about what you think some of the turning points were for you that set you on the path to success with your career?
You know, I'd like to always, when I get asked this question, I like to go back to actually my childhood. I think that's what did it. And I actually blog about it, but I grew up in the Soviet Union, and I grew up in what I call a gender neutral culture. You know, boys, girls all played together. And I think that's the way I was also brought up. And, you know, I love to ride a bicycle and play hockey. Didn't like dolls so much. I believe that really set me up for much later in life when I entered University of California, Berkeley. And I was one of the very few girls at that point in the computer science department. I felt very comfortable. I wasn't intimidated. Boys were some of my best friends, and I think that that really is what set me up for dealing with, being a minority, being often the only woman in the room, way back in the day, especially when I went to college. And then the other thing is really just hard work. I am a true believer of what Malcolm Gladwell so well writes about in his book, The Outliers. The 10,000 hours. You gotta put in time. You gotta put in time. You gotta work hard, and there's timing. And you gotta hit timing. That's some luck. Some ability, some of it is your intuition, some of it is just being in the right place in the right time.
It sounds like you made your own luck a little bit too.
Well, we all do, but timing is,
Yeah.
I grew up in the days of Silicon Valley becoming what it is today.
Yeah.
When I graduated from college, there weren't that many startups, but I was fortunate to join a startup. So again, timing, the fact that I was in Berkeley, the startup was in Berkeley, Ingress was the name of the company. Yes, somewhat is you make the choices. Of course, you make the choices. But some of it is, of course, where you are, the circumstances that you're in, and the hard work.
Great. Renee, what about you? Can you point to anything, was there that one thing or one or two things that you thought were the turning point for you?
A couple of things. I think it's more than one or two or three things, but let me try to be succinct. My background. I'm a first-generation American. I was born in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty to immigrants. My mom and dad came to this country from the island of Jamaica, and in the 50s to expedite their citizenship. My dad joined the Army and my mom joined the Women's Army Corps. Now, they did not know each other until they actually met in Japan. And so I literally said I was born in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty. I was born on Governor's Island, Fort J Army Hospital, which is literally the shadow of the Statue of Liberty. So to some degree, my path felt like I was born into it as part of it. And there was an expectation set by my parents that they came to this country because they believed if you worked hard, the hard work there, right? If you work hard and you play by the rules, you could succeed. But my mother also recognized they gave me a masculine name because she said she was giving birth to a Black girl in America. Black, a challenge in this country, as most recently everyone's become much more aware, and a girl. So she kept the name and she kept the child, and I was thankful, and I used the pronoun she, her, hers. Let me say the next important thing that kind of set a path for success, I think, for me, was I went to an all-girls school, Chafee School for young ladies, and we were the first class to graduate co-ed, Loomis Chafee. We had 2 years of single-sex education, but the important part about that was they gave us this motto: horses sweat, people perspire, but Chafee girls glow. I knew I was, now my father didn't think it was a glow, and I got in the car after a lacrosse game smelling like nothing, but anyhow, the notion of that I could be anything, right? That I glow, that there was something special and unique about me, and recognizing that. And that's one of the principles that I use when we talk about diversity, that we're all unique and have a unique contribution to make. So it's the recognition that there's something that we have that we can bring and we can give. I'd say the next important piece for me that created a path on this, because I'm a chemist by training, but I would do this work around equity and inclusion, diversity, equity, and inclusion, was I was appointed to head the Presidential Glass Ceiling Commission, which you had identified as part of the Civil Rights Act of '91, to look at the barriers that impede the advancement of women and minorities. And I got to that role, not because I knew what all the barriers were, yes, I had experienced them, but I got there because of a network and a mentor. And so for me, the networking has always been fundamental. And it is one of the things we look at when we see barriers in institutions. It's the networking. That's part of why mentoring becomes so important. It's not just about you, but your visibility to those in leadership who can make decisions about your next steps beyond yourself. But those are some of the things. So I will fundamentally say those were some of the important pieces, lessons learning over a lifetime. And I would say the final piece was losing my hair, because it really gave me a sense of transition and time and change, and the things you can control and the things you can't. I can control my hair loss. That just was, I had my beautiful locks, I had my queen braid forever. Last year, you all saw me with my queen braid. That finally fell out. I was going to bring it down for this event and hold it up for those folks who remember, but I was like, okay, look at this. But it made me recognize there's things I can do and things I can't do, things within my control and things outside of my control, and to be able to focus and have clarity on what it is that I can do. So those were, I would say, some of the critical elements for me.
Mm-hmm. I think that's great learnings. Thank you. So I've seen programs, particularly in the tech sector, I've definitely seen some things work. I've seen some things that clearly just didn't work, right? And yet we still haven't really moved the needle. So are there things that either of you can point to where you could say, you know what, we were able to move along a group of women, we're able to change our business? Or what are some of those programs that you see that you think are really crucial at an organization to ensure that you have, so you can think about better or greater diversity and inclusion? Is it mentorship? Is it enterprise resource groups? Like, what do you think it is that can really help?
I would say, let me try to take a stab at it. What I would say is education is number one. And education comes in many forms.
Right.
I like to talk about unconscious bias. It's there. It's there in men and women. That's the thing. It's there just because we grow up, we're conditioned by our environments. And so basically peeling it back and educating, just having people acknowledge that there is that bias in an organization is important. And then you need a support environment where you take that education and you nourish it, right? And you provide an environment where it can be absorbed. And that comes, for example, at the Central, we have a number of diversity programs. Like I chair the diversity program, I'm the chair for the diversity programs. We have 12 offices around the world, and people work in different hours, obviously different countries. we all have to coalesce together, and we all have to have a common set of values that we develop so that we can be a team, and yet we have to all acknowledge our differences. And so what do programs and education and involve? They involve mentoring. They involve, for example, leading groups, which we use our own technology, being a communication company, our own messaging, our own video, to get people connected. And then you have to be able to talk about it openly in the company. People have to have forums where they can openly, women, minorities, people with different preferences, LGBT community. We have to have these forums for people to express their concerns, their opinions, and have support from both their peers and management. And it's very critical that management is really involved, because otherwise, it just sort of, it's the troops are at it, but if the management doesn't voice it, doesn't make it a priority, doesn't go as far as saying, we're gonna ask for you to interview this many women for every one of your positions. We're not dictating who you hire, but we're telling you that and we're asking you to open doors. Because if you don't open doors, they won't open by themselves.
So you said listening and then take action, right? So you can't just listen and listen and not do anything differently.
Yeah, right, exactly. You have, and taking action and showing your involvement. You have to be active. You have to take initiative. And for example, I often I often spend time with women. And just to give you, as leading by example, as a really important part of this, I used to have a staff of vice presidents, none of which were women. Okay. Now I'm proud to say that a quarter to a third are women.
Just setting that example.
And the selection process is based on merit, which you have to give people an opportunity.
Let me add on to that. Thank you, Kara, so much for that. A couple of things. First and foremost, organizations have to live their values. Don't espouse a value. We talk a lot about trust. Trust is the confidence born out of character and competence of an individual or an institution, right? One of the waves of trust, I do a lot of work with Franklin Covey, and if you haven't had a chance to look at Speed of Trust, it's well worth looking at, folks. It talks about 5 waves of trust, first starting with self-trust, your cores of credibility, next relationship trust, the people, and then organizational trust, right? Alignment. How do organizations align its values with its practice? And then how do we practice accountability within these institutions? Too often times we see diversity, equity, and inclusion, racial justice, gender equity, LGBTQIA rights, people with disability access. We see all of these broken out into the many different pieces, and we see institutions doing a whole bunch of activities. If they are not aligned to a core strategy that holds the highest leadership, including boards of directors, accountable for successful completion of objectives towards the diversity, equity, and inclusion goals, then you have to have a whole bunch of activities. And so we see institutions, and we have people that come to us and say, we've got 17 programs, we got 6 initiatives, we got ERGs, employee resource groups, we got affinity groups, we've done diversity training, bias training, performance training, emotional intelligence tests. We've done all of this, and we're still kind of looking where we maybe moved the needle a percentage, and that's if we include all elements of diversity and leadership. Part of it is they never tied any of this to a cogent strategy, right? Otherwise, and so once we see, when we're able to work with institutions to align whatever their diversity and equity, justice, and whatever language your institution wants to use, Whenever you ensure within the overall organizational, strategic, or operational plan that there are indicators or metrics for diversity, equity, inclusion, quantitative, qualitative, and anecdotal evidence, that these have to be tied in and implicit in the organization's plan for growth and development. Otherwise, it continues to marginalize this as a separate plan. And then we get leaders to say, I've got 5 different plans I'm following right now. We got our strategic plan, I got my business plan, I got my team plan, I got my project plan, and now you want me to have a diversity plan? Really? No, we want that. Diversity, equity, and inclusion has to be implicit and used as metrics within institutions to recognize a change not only in the workforce, but the culture and the way in which they interact with markets. I don't have anything else to say. I'm done.
You said to me the other day, something I thought was really important was consistency, right? It's about applying everything in a consistent manner, right? I think people get excited, they start something, people lose interest, nobody's in charge.
Yeah, no one's in charge. And so how do we hold individuals accountable? I had the opportunity to be appointed by the court to oversee Coca-Cola North America. It was a $192.5 million settlement. So if you don't think that there's a bottom line to the lack of diversity or equity or culture that's welcoming, $192.5 million, think about that right there. So if for nothing else. But what was one of the most important things that I thought we did? Tied pay and compensation of the senior executives to the ability to deliver on the diversity, equity, and inclusion objectives. When they were held accountable, and then we created peer accountability. So information officer, finance officer, whatever your top tier CEO performance group might be, they have to operate together. So if one is not making progress, they all don't make any bonus. You tie them all together. You lead a corporation, it's one institution, therefore you're responsible. If you're in that role of power and authority, then you're responsible for the whole thing as a team. So that was one of the important pieces that I learned from that experience. Yeah.
That's great. So we're about to wrap up. Can I just get a quick thought from each of you? If you're in the middle part of your career right now, you've gone through Corona. We're facing really an upheaval, I think, in social justice. Maybe we're going to go back to jobs. We're probably not going to go back to jobs in the way we did. If you're in the middle of your career now, what's that one piece of advice you would give somebody right now that they should be thinking about, right? There's lots and lots of things I think that are causing stressors right now. Then focus on what they can control. So what would be one thing that you would suggest to someone who's in the mid part of their career to think about what they could do maybe differently over the next 6 months or so?
Center self, identify what's important for you, and make a plan. Because it's a new world order. I mean, that ought to be actions and activities that we do just consistently and regularly with ourselves. That the people who perform best in work are the people whose values, personal values and goals align with the mission with their institution. So, you know, whether you're thinking of staying with your existing employer, if you're employed, or even running your own business like I do, I have to constantly, the reason I run my business is because I really can't work for anybody else. I got to be able to align myself. My personal values and objectives have to be expressed in the work I do. Because as Kira said, we work hard. We put in lots of hours. Those hours have to not be in vain. They need to be enabling my energy in order to continue and to move forward. So I would just recommend getting in touch with yourself and what you see for yourself, and write it down, type it down, text it to yourself. Put it as a reminder. I set things like that as reminders for myself, and they pop up every day at different times. And I'm always amazed, like when it pops up, I'm always at a moment of like, oh my gosh, what am I supposed to be doing now? And then the reminder pops up. I have an Apple Watch. I'm not advertising Apple because they didn't pay me to advertise them. But it will vibrate, and I get to look at it, and it makes me take a pause so that I can progress. And so we call it pause to progress. Lining your values, pause to progress.
Sure. What about you? What would you recommend? Is there any advice you can give everybody as they're listening and thinking about what they can do to help affect change for themselves going forward?
Well, first of all, I agree with everything that Renee said. It's about having a plan and measuring yourself to that plan. And especially now that we're all at home, it's working from home. it's very easy to sort of go into a routine where one day flows into another day and you don't even notice the days go by. So you have to assess where you are. Is that where you want to be? If you want change, build a plan. And whether you're at home or in the, when we all go back to the office, which eventually will happen, although probably won't be in the same format, ask yourself, where do you want to be? Like, what do you want to do? Where do you want to be? Do you want to work more from home? Do you like the job that you're doing? Are you happy? Because this is a good time to retrospect, because we are spending a lot of time with ourselves in front of media. So basically, the important thing about your career is always assessing that you are where you want to be, or you're on the way where you want to be, or you're taking the steps that you need to take to get to where you want to be. And if you don't get to where you want to be necessarily, that's not necessarily bad. I'm a serial entrepreneur, and venture capitalists always say, there's no failed startups, there's the next startup, So that's also an important thing, because being by yourself, it might be a little bit, and at home in this environment, it might be a little bit more challenging to seek support groups. But you should be doing that, and you need to communicate. We talked, and this would be also time to say, do I need to pick a mentor? Do I need to look out to somebody that is going to help me think through what I need to think through? Build a plan. That makes a big difference. Having somebody who you can consult with, as informal as possible. And if you're mid through your career, and for example, you're on maternity leave, right? This would also be a good time to take a step back. And for example, Lean Central offers 100% paid maternity, and we have people who are taking their time right now to bring their newborns into the family, and also reassess. Okay, what does it mean for me? Do I want to go back full time? Maybe you don't. There's no shame in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for me, somebody at one point just said to me, Michelle, just wake up. It's like, be more conscious about what you're doing, right? Be more intentional about how you think about things, or else you're just going to go through the rest of your life and you're going to let people make those decisions for you, right? Because you're just going to go with the flow. And I think maybe you said it before, but this idea of just having this plan and having a friend who will call you and remind you. So Renee said, get your iWatch, right? Your watch might be your best friend on this one. But sometimes I have a friend that just calls me. He's like, okay, this is what we talked about the last time. What have you done on that? Right? And just holds you a little bit accountable to it. And I think gives you a path so that you're just not constantly sort of wishing that you could be at the next stage, right? It actually helps you get there. So listen, this was great. Thank you both, Kira, and thank you, Renee. And with that, I'm going to end this session. I hope you're all enjoying the day. Please network with each other. I think share some ideas on this, and I am going to turn this back over to the next session. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you, Kira.
Nice to meet you.